Brent, who would be your favorite fictional dad?
I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Parenthood. Character played by Steve Martin, and I cannot remember his name in the film at this point, but what a great movie talking about the realities of life and of parenthood. Watching him bumble through, but at the same time emotionally grapple with what does it mean to be a dad, and then he finds out he's going to be a dad again, and kind of a little bit later in life, and what does that do, and yet such love and yet reality as they go through the ups and downs of life, and that really spoke a lot to me as I watched that movie. It's an old one, been out for years. There may be some others, but that one really sticks out in my mind, primarily because of the reality of the emotional ups and downs, the goods, the bads, the positives, the negatives of being a dad and watching your kids stumble, watching them have to figure out how to go through life, and knowing that you can't always help, but you want to be there. That's powerful. If people haven't seen it, I would encourage them to see it.
For me, fictional fathers were something that I kind of clung to because my dad really wasn't around a whole lot. So it's kind of easy to kind of gear towards fictional fathers of what I wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember as a kid watching The Rifleman.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But here was this tough guy, but he was always interested in his son, and his son was number one, and how he just kind of had his best interest at heart. Of course, my mom used to watch like Little House on the Prairie, so seeing, Pa Engel and how he was there for his family, things like that. So for me, it was just seeing things like that I kind of gravitated for because I had a hunger for it myself.
Yeah. That's powerful to be able to see it, even when you're not feeling it. You get a sense for what that might be.
Yeah.
And what it could be.
That's right.
That's made an impact on your life, I would imagine, huge for being a father for you.
It has, because in that, what I didn't have, I wanted for my girls. I didn't, it was one of those things where I didn't want them to ever feel what I felt.
Right, yeah, for sure, yeah. I remember watching the Cosby Show, and watching Bill Cosby as a father in that, and such compassion, and yet kind of a firmness of, I'm going to challenge you to know what's right and wrong. That one made an impact on me too. Yeah. So Tim, what would you say would be perhaps some godly wisdom, biblical wisdom that you've identified over the years as a father of 3 girls, all adults and on their own now?
Right.
Yeah. What piece of advice would you give us?
Well, actually, it's out of James, where we are to be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Yeah, and when you've got 4 women in the house, you have to be slow to speak anyways. Because just kidding.
You just learned.
Yeah. But I think that's one of, I think especially for a dad of girls, that one of the greatest gifts I could give to them was just really listening to them and being a part of their life. So being quick to listen and slow to speak instead of trying to interject, interrupt, fix. And of course, slow to anger too, because if you express anger, then they begin to shut down. Sure. So I think that out of James was really pivotal for me in the point of coming alongside my children. Yeah. So how about for you and your twins?
Yeah, one sticks out in my mind. We had twins. They are fraternal, not identical, and yet as different as night and day. And one of the things that stuck out really was trying to figure out how to treat them not the same. They did everything the same. They went everywhere the same. But as they were growing up, trying to treat them as individuals. Remembering Psalm 139, speaking of how God has fearfully and wonderfully created us and uniquely framed us individually, and trying to figure out how to do that, and even if they weren't twins, I mean, the ability to understand the unique differences that each one of us has, and how to live out of our strengths, not just our weaknesses, and trying to always change and build on them, but to live out of the strengths, and recognize, and to be honest, my boys were as different as night and day, and one did it one way, one did it the other way, and it was a challenge at times to really encourage them both for being who they are. But that's a challenge for all of us as fathers. I think we all have to look at our children and say, wait a minute, who has God created this child, this person to be, and how can I best come alongside them? I think of Ephesians that talks about not exasperating our kids, but coming alongside and I think encouraging them and building them up and pointing them to their own relationship with the Lord and working toward that. And that a lot of that is individuality. Another thing I remember from my dad that my dad was kind of a talker, not loud and not always talking, but when we needed to sit down and have a talk, that's how he handled things, was that we sat down and had a talk. Right. I remember often sitting on the edge of the bed and just having a conversation. It wasn't so much, hey, you're in trouble and this is going to be a problem. It's let's sit down and talk about this. That made a huge impact on me, and I try to do that with my boys over the years. Try to do that with a lot of others to sit, hey, let's talk about this. Right. And I think that's something for all fathers and parents to take into consideration.
I think what you talked about too, in the point of bringing out the true personality of your children and honoring the personality of your children is so true, because like you said, I do feel that goes across the board, not just people who have twins. Because in that regard, it's easier to manage one way. I remember hearing because I said so. Right. And then and so we're trying to manage in one way. So, but you, like for me, 3 girls, taking 3 personalities and trying to manage them one way, it didn't work. Not gonna work. No. So I really appreciate that, because that resonates with me. But it takes more effort to say, okay, who are you as an individual? Absolutely. Not that I'm going to let you run wild, but in the same regard, I want you to be you, and I want you to be you, because as you've said, God created us in such a way to where we are individuals. Right.
It's real easy to get into that rut of wanting to do things one way and do that for everybody. It's convenience. And it's convenience for us, really more for us than anybody else. But the ability to say, no, I need to find the courage, I need to find the flexibility, I need to find the willingness to say, no, I need to deal with each child individually for who they are, I think is perhaps really, really powerful for parents.
And I think for me, because I didn't feel it as a kid, the point of love, I can look back on it now and see that my parents did the best they could with what they had. Yeah. And that was another thing too, is just to really not only verbalize, but also to put into action a point of love. Right. Because it's one thing to say, well, my dad never said he loved me, but he showed me he did. Right. I think kids need both. They need that verbal affirmation, as well as just the actions themselves. And that's something too. Is just, as God is love, He didn't just say He loved us. God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. And I feel that we need to make that effort too, to each individual child, not just, I love you all equally. It's just a point of that we love them for who they are and really cherish them, even when they're frustrating. Right.
Oh yeah, for sure. Maybe even more so when they're very frustrated at that time, because that's when we go back to what we want and what we need it to be. Yeah. I also know that talking about how our parents maybe did the best they could, I also know that we need to be parents that are constantly learning and constantly changing. It is one thing to say, I think we did the best we could, but in reality, we can always do a little bit better, because nobody's perfect, and we're not going to get to that perfection. So the ability to say, I'm sorry, the ability to recognize when we perhaps have done something wrong, that we need to go and ask forgiveness from our kids when we need to recognize that, hey, I was out of sorts and I treated you wrong or bad, and I want you to know that I recognize that, and I've asked God for forgiveness, and I now will need to come to you. I think if we are growing, if we are learning, if we are teachable ourselves, I think that's what we share and help encourage in our kids, so that they are constantly learning and growing as well.
And I think they need to see us striving even in our spiritual walk.
Oh, absolutely.
That we're seeking God for wisdom because we don't know. And just like you said, that element of humility, instead of because I'm the parent and I said so.
Right, exactly.
You're right. We can mess up.
Yeah. And as they grow, as their kids get older, and of course we have adult kids, but as they grow and they move into that adulthood, the ability to transfer from being that parent-child relationship to being adult-to-adult relationship, where we're dealing kind of on the same level. We're never not going to be parents, for sure, but we will, I think, have that relationship with them where we get to share one-on-one as friends and as adults, and we need to encourage that in our kids so that even when they come home, even when they're with us, that they're not falling back into that kind of adult or parent-child relationship, but more of an adult-to-adult
because that's, I think that's one thing too, and I know you and I have talked about this, is the point of even parenting has its transitions.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Because as they're little children, we're caretakers. As they become older, we become coaches. But then when they become adults, we become consultants.
Yes,
and
that's exactly right.
you pay a consultant for their opinion. It's not just given for free.
Do whatever you want with it.
Exactly. And that's hard.
And that's hard.
Because especially with adult children, because you want them to live right. You want them to not be in pain or hurting.
Right.
But in the same regard, you've also got to give the responsibility to them instead of being that parent again and pulling the responsibility of because I said so.
Well, and a lot of that comes by being able early to put the responsibility for their decisions onto them rather than always onto us. I think, from the very beginning, I always talked about choice, I always talked about responsibility. You have lots of choices. You don't get to choose the consequences, but you do get to choose. And so helping them to understand what responsibility goes on them and to take that responsibility helps them when they transition to adulthood, when all responsibility then falls with them. And that's a transition over time, but I think that's one of the goals of parenting, is that we help them to transition from somebody else being in control and responsible to them being in control and responsible. And that's going to involve discipline. It's going to involve perhaps some negative discipline at times, but nonetheless, that's the purpose, as Hebrews tells us, that is painful at the moment, but it will yield a benefit. And we've got to pay attention to that.
And also, we need to know that each transition has its own grief for us as parents.
Yes.
But it also has that element of celebration because they are becoming their own person, which, like we talked about before, of treating them as their own person and then releasing them to be their own person.
Absolutely.
There is a grief in that, but there's also a tremendous celebration. And I think as we begin to, if I can say this, lose our identity as a parent, we really do then become adult to adult.
Adult to adult, exactly.
And celebrate in that.
Right.
But as we also can see that many times our identity can get wrapped up in parenthood, where really our identity needs to be in Christ.
In Christ and in the Lord, absolutely, and not in the parenting. And that's probably something that many of us have struggled with over time, but kind of how our kids are doing is how I'm spiritually doing.
Right.
And that's not necessarily true, and I think we have to guard against that.
Or we even need to guard against how my kids are doing reflects on how I am as a parent to other people.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. There's so many things. I think we could probably talk for hours. But I think one thing that always comes to my mind is as the Lord has discipline in us at times, I think the purpose of that discipline is to make sure that we're understanding discipline, in my opinion, for not just behavior, but for attitude as well, helping them understand that there is a control that you have over how you respond. You don't get to control perhaps the emotions that come, but you do control what you do with them.
Exactly.
And that's what attitude is.
Right. Yeah. Instead of reacting, we need to be responding.
Exactly.
And in that, we really need to be leaning on Christ so that through the Holy Spirit, He manifests that fruit of the Spirit. Because we don't even know how to love right.
No.
We don't know how to love unconditionally. And then all the way down to self-control, which we can easily, let me own it. I can easily lose that.
That's right. Well, that's where the gospel is true, even in parenting, where we recognize that we can't do this on our own. It's something that we have to allow God to be doing through us. So there's a great humility and a patience and an endurance for this that only comes as we trust in the Lord for our children and for our parenting and for who they are going to be and for the choices that they will make. And how do we live with that when they're not making choices we might think that we would like them to make? And at the same time, we still have to love them. We still have to be there for them, have to encourage them. And that's part of that transition that sometimes is not always easy to make.
And I think sometimes even just giving our children that grace, but then also we can be hard on ourselves because, I didn't do it right.
For sure.
And then we need to be a recipient of God's grace in that regard as
Oh,
well.
there are many things I'd love to go back and do. If I knew then what I know now.
I have so many Father of the Year awards on that.
Yeah. We could change the world if we go back now. One thing that I wish I had done a much better job at, that I wish I could change, was the amount and the times of our own devotion times. It was so sporadic, and I wish I could be more consistent. I vacillated between being kind of a, we're all going to do this, to anybody want to do this? And of course, it just was up and down. And that in particular is one thing I think I would go back and I wish I could have done a much better job at. Yeah.
I think for me, one of the things too was that while the kids were young, especially, I know they say quality time, but let's be real. It needs to be consistent time to where they feel like they're truly important and a priority in life. And I look back on, because we were starting out, I was working full-time, going to school full-time, and I know I can justify that my time was pulled, but I can also see as I go back on that there was almost a selfishness that because I'm working, because I'm going to school, that when I come home, I really need just kind of me time.
Right.
Instead of just embracing the kids and bringing them in and making them more of a priority. That's something that I look at that I wish I had done more of.
Sure. Yeah.
Is really just letting each child know that regardless of what's going on, you're still a priority in my life.
Yeah. I remember there were times, lots of times, when I think the frustration came not because of my kids, but on my own part.
Exactly.
And there were times when I think I was wanting them to get to bed or to do their chores or to do something more for me than because I was, really concerned about them. Right. And that's another thing I wish I could go back and kind of redo a little bit, where I was more focused on them on those times rather than, and then perhaps on myself. And that's a frustration.
What's really been kind of fun with adult children too is just to have that conversation, and the conversation of the things that they wish I had done differently and the things I hold that I wish I had done differently are two different lists.
Two different lists, yeah.
And let's be real, nobody can beat up Tim like Tim, so I can I can look at the things going, I should have done that.
Sure.
And not that we've gone through the whole list, but it's kind of amazing how they go, I don't really remember that, but there's this.
Right.
But even in that, I think that, like you had talked about before, it isn't so much doing parenting perfectly because we're not going to,
no.
But having that humility of being willing to go to a child.
Absolutely.
I mean, that to me is so valid and real, because then what you're doing is you're actually teaching your child a life lesson. When you mess up, you own it, and you try to make amends with it.
Well, I think it also helps them to understand the reality of what this world is. That's the way the world is. And if we're expecting it to be one way, to do everything the way I want it to be done and everything to fit me, they're going to be sorely mistaken. And it's a lesson learned early to know how to be flexible, to know how to be humble, and to realize that good times are going to come, bad times are going to come. It has been perhaps a huge struggle for many over this lockdown these last couple of months to have to kind of figure out some of those things. And I'm sure that it's going to be one of those look back on and what did we do during the lockdown, that maybe a lot of regrets, hopefully not too many, but I know that that's certainly going on in a lot of homes. Yeah.
That's true.
Sure. Tim, I hope you have a great Father's Day on Sunday. Happy Father's Day, and it's been great talking with you.
Brent, I hope you have a great Father's Day as well. And I always appreciate our time together.
Always a blast.
That's right.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.